My name is John Tyler. I'm with the Ewing, Marion, Kaufman Foundation. I've been there 18 years as its general counsel, secretary, chief ethics officer, but I also have a role in doing outreach into philanthropy. One of the things, so just some background about the Kaufman Foundation, the question was asked earlier why foundations are doing entrepreneurship. And my answer, which I didn't give earlier because I was going to give now, was easy. Ewing Kaufman said, you will do entrepreneurship. And Mr. Kaufman, who generated his wealth through pharmaceutical companies, he died in 1993. So back in the late 80s, early 90s, Mr. Kaufman was saying, wait a second, I created wealth, and actually he'd be the first one to say he didn't create it. He had a team of people, there were colleagues and associates who created the wealth. Through an entrepreneurial venture. He started his pharmaceutical company in 1950, an employee of one himself, and he didn't name it Kaufman Labs, he named it Marion Labs because he didn't want to be showing up as Kaufman. And he started that with $5,000, and he was the janitor, he was the president, he was marketing, he was sales, he was everything, as most entrepreneurial experiences are early on. But he realized later in life that he sure wished he had mentors at different points along the way. He sure wished he had different access to information and to knowledge. And perhaps there was a way that he could use his philanthropy to help make the entrepreneurial experience more common for people. And part of the reason he wanted to do that was he recognized the role, the important role of entrepreneurship in communities. He recognized the important role of entrepreneurship for human dignity, for self-fulfillment, for self-respect, for innovation, for personal integrity, for integrity of the people around and the communities around the entrepreneurs. And Mr. Kaufman even talked about entrepreneurship as a way to address racism. And he talked about education, which is another core mission area of the foundation, particularly urban education, as a way to address racism. And Mr. Kaufman looked at those two areas. Now this is back in the 1980s, early 1990s. Mr. Kaufman died in 1993. So we were very much blessed with Mr. Kaufman's not only financial resources, which were substantial, but clear direction and clear vision for our philanthropy. Now, how we approach entrepreneurship has changed over the years. How we approach education has changed over the years. But some of that, in both instances, is what we do and how we do it are both as important as each other. And perhaps more important than the money that we provide. And so, we do entrepreneurial things in the education side. We run a charter school, the Ewing, Marion, Kaufman School, a charter school in Kansas City, Missouri, that targets exactly, if you're looking for success, you don't start a charter school that focuses on the 5 zip codes with the highest murder, highest crime, lowest literacy, highest unemployment. But that's where Mr. Kaufman would go, and that's where we've gone. With entrepreneurship, our programs have evolved and changed, which is what Mr. Kaufman's business did, and which is what he asked us to do. And in the last couple of years, we've gone through a retooling of our entrepreneurship programming. Andrew earlier mentioned my colleague, Victor Huang, who's our Vice President of Entrepreneurship. He's been there about 1.5 years, and we are now executing on the strategy that the board and the management has pulled together that focuses on individual entrepreneurs, outreach to individual entrepreneurs, communities, ecosystems, ecosystem building, inclusion, race, gender, and geography, and then also knowledge, the power of knowledge, the power of ideas, and how, as one of the panelists earlier mentioned, how policy affects what we do and how we do it. And so we continue to be in the policy realm and the data realm around entrepreneurship. In fact, we were at the forefront of generating data around entrepreneurs. So the data that you've heard mentioned, or the conclusion that you've heard mentioned about entrepreneurs are the job creators in our country. That's Kaufman data, my colleagues' work that they did because there was data available. So that's a little bit about the Kaufman Foundation. I want to ask my co-panelists up here to talk a little bit about their foundations and their work. And part of what you'll see is we've got an interesting, very experienced group of philanthropists in the entrepreneurship space. We've got Sarah from the Case Foundation, and the Case Foundation is both a foundation, but Steve and Jean Case are also very much alive, and they've got yeah, right? and they've got Revolution. So there are things that they do on the for-profit and nonprofit side of things, and balancing some of those things out. Tony with the Blackstone Charitable Foundations, and of course Blackstone is still very much alive and vibrant in creating entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship on the for-profit side, and Tony will talk some about that. And Debbie's going to bring sort of an international flair in addition to what the Paul E. Singer Foundation does in the United States, to do a great deal of work in Israel and some of the lessons from Israel. So having taken your speeches away from you, Sarah, why don't you go ahead and introduce Case?
It's the best way to keep us short, right, is to already touch the highlights. So hello, as John mentioned, I'm Sarah Koch from the Case Foundation, and a quick overview of what we focus on to give you some context of some of the comments and questions that at least I will hopefully bring to this panel today. The Case Foundation has been around for 20 years and founded by two tech entrepreneurs, Jean and Steve Case, who are still alive. It's interesting as I've heard the conversation today and talking about what kind of influence that having an entrepreneur founder can bring, whether it's to a nonprofit or a foundation or things like that. It's an interesting juxtaposition sometimes to see those that still have living entrepreneur founders versus the family or the legacy of their founders, and how that can affect the values. But that's something that is constantly front of mind for the Cases, and the way that they built the foundation and the way that they want us to do our work is to think about ourselves as fostering entrepreneurship in everything that we do, literally through entrepreneurs, for-profit entrepreneurs, and also bringing the entrepreneurial mindset to the nonprofit sector and trying to build innovation within the nonprofit space through things like risk-taking and being okay with failure, and basically all of the talking points of the children entrepreneurs who are up here today. But our two main focus areas for right now are impact investing, which is a space that we've been in for some time, and anybody who's paying attention to social entrepreneurship and impact investing, and the fact that people actually raised their hands earlier when Darren asked, who does impact investments, is really building steam and is starting to become something that foundations play around with a little bit more, that serious investors are starting to build into their portfolios to invest for both a financial and a social return. And then the other area for us that I'm representing mostly here today is around inclusive entrepreneurship. As I mentioned in a question earlier, an answer to a question, for us is really looking at race, place, and gender, and particularly focusing on women entrepreneurs, African-American entrepreneurs, and Latino entrepreneurs. And the stats out there are terrible, which we'll probably get into later, around access to capital, access to social capital resources in addition to financial capital, and just figuring out how do we make sure that those resources get into the hands of entrepreneurs who need them so that they have an equal chance to scale their business. And it's how good the business is that decides if it's going to succeed, and not where they're from or what kind of background that they have. So, on to you.
Wonderful. So Tony Tolentino with the Blackstone Charitable Foundation. I've been with the foundation for about 7 years, and I think, being a little unique here, I think we're one of the few corporate foundations here, aside from maybe JP Morgan Chase. I think somebody was here earlier from them. So it is a unique approach to entrepreneurship than many of you here in the room. So our foundation was created back in 2007, so we've only been around for roughly 10 years now, and was created when Blackstone went public. They decided to create, essentially, as part of the IPO, a separate fund to create this foundation. And when we were trying to figure out what we were going to do in those early years, almost it was serendipitous. I mean, the financial crisis happened at the same time, 2007, 2008, 2009, and the leaders of the firm, especially Steve Shoresman, our CEO and co-founder, decided to focus our efforts on entrepreneurship, and for one of two reasons. One, we wanted to be responsive to what was happening at the time, and he strongly felt that job creation, business formation was something that the firm and our foundation should be focused on. But two, he considers himself an entrepreneur, which makes it very nice when he tells a story, especially when he goes to one of our events and actually meets entrepreneurs. He tells them, I created Blackstone, with his business partner, Pete Peterson, $400,000 in capital and a Rolodex, and look at what it's become. Blackstone's now this very major, big company now. So in terms of our approach and how we support entrepreneurs, so the foundation, we are regionally focused, and that's primarily responsible, related back to the reason that we're a corporate foundation. We only go to places where Blackstone has business, and we define that primarily as places where we have investors, offices, portfolio companies. Blackstone has a pretty wide breadth in terms of their businesses and where they're located. So it's sort of easy to check that box. But in our due diligence in determining, after checking that box, we look at regions where essentially all the pieces are in place for us as a catalytic funder that we could create something to really move the needle there for that ecosystem. So we talk to elected officials, nonprofit leaders, higher education institutions, the entrepreneurs themselves, to really figure out sort of what the missing gaps are in that ecosystem for us to create a program. So our foundation, we have three essentially program areas right now under our entrepreneurship initiative. One is our Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network, which is for high growth entrepreneurs. That's in North Carolina and Colorado. We have Blackstone Launchpad, which you've heard earlier, thanks to the Burton D. Morgan Foundation. That's focused on college and university entrepreneurs. That's a network of 20 universities right now across the United States and Ireland. I could go more into that if anybody has questions how that works. And then the Blackstone Inclusive Entrepreneurship Challenge, thanks to the work of the Case Foundation and Kaufman and everything, and also hearing what was happening on the ground. We kicked off a new program earlier this year in Chicago focused on inclusive entrepreneurship and ensuring entrepreneurs there. Specifically, we're focusing on entrepreneurs of color, women, veterans, and immigrants, and ensuring that they have access to the resources they need to scale and grow their businesses.
Great.
Debbie.
I'm Debbie Hochberg from the Paul Singer Foundation in New York. Similar to Sarah, I have a living philanthropist principal. Paul Singer, as some of you may know, is a hedge fund manager who is an entrepreneur himself. He built his business. We just had our 40th year anniversary. And he is known for being somewhat of an activist in his investing, and a lot of that mentality sort of plays out in our foundation. So we are very entrepreneurial in our investments. We've been around, Paul's been a check writer for a long time. We've been strategic for probably the past 5 to 7 years. I've been at the foundation for 5 years and have really seen how a lot of our early ideas have come to fruition, how we've been able to scale them, grow, build partnerships, learn from mistakes, fix our course, et cetera. We focus sort of on 2 main buckets in the foundation. One we call American values, which is largely free market economy, rule of law, constitutional rights, and the other piece we call sort of broadly Jewish Israel. And it's in that bucket that entrepreneurship actually plays a role, although the entrepreneurship narrative really is relevant to both, and increasingly to the American values. It's become a much more important narrative in the American values even in the past year and a half. So what we focus on is working with young business leaders, primarily on college campuses, Jewish and non-Jewish, and connecting them to Israel through business experiences and building relationships with them so they can experience Israel. Why Israel? So many of you may have heard of or read of a book called Startup Nation. One of my colleagues, Dan Senor, actually wrote the book, and what that book did was it really laid out the activity in entrepreneurship and innovation that has grown in Israel over the past 20 years. And I can go into all sorts of facts and figures, but Israel today has the largest percentage of venture capital investment and R&D centers per capita as a percent of GDP in the world. It's known as Silicon Wadi. There are all sorts of different terms that people refer to Israel, and there are all sorts of reasons why there's this culture of entrepreneurship and innovation. And at the foundation, we saw a real opportunity to elevate this narrative and to connect business, government, and NGO leaders all over the world to this incredible island, essentially, of innovation and entrepreneurship, and make it accessible to people who want to access Israeli innovation and who may not know how to connect to it, who may not know what's happening, and build real business relationships. We say we are not interested in innovation tourism. We are interested in actually improving and fueling economic growth globally by inspiring people and connecting them to innovation in Israel. There's a lot more to go. I can go into on that. I want to say two other things. One, the organization that I'm referring to, Startup Nation Central, is one of our largest philanthropic investments, and our second largest partner is the William Davidson Foundation. And it's been really fun to partner with them and create scale together and deepen impact, and we're constantly learning together. So I've learned a huge amount today. This has been really interesting for me. And I also would say that there's been a theme of entrepreneurship as a true driver of economic growth. And speaking from the vantage of Paul Singer, to him, the only way to actually create real economic growth is through entrepreneurship and innovation. So coming from an investor's point of view, I think that you guys are all on to something really important, and we're excited to help out, work with you guys, and answer any questions you may have.
Well, let's pick up with the theme, Debbie, that you just left us with, which is in some ways the theme of collaboration and working together. And there have been, and earlier today we heard some conversations about foundations working together in the entrepreneurship space, which I think is pretty exciting, because foundations sometimes have a history of not working well together. But in entrepreneurship, as it has grown as a field of philanthropy, there have been some great, I think, examples of collaborations. Can you talk about some of those? And maybe why don't we start with Tony on this one?
Sure. So, and I wish Deb Hoover was still here from the Burton D. Morgan Foundation earlier, because that's actually a great partnership that we actually had with the Burton D. Morgan Foundation for Northeast Ohio. So Blackstone Launchpad, our university program, so we actually partnered with them. Ohio, for our interest, was identified as a region of priority for us as a firm. We went there, being a national funder, being based in New York. We didn't know the ecosystem. We did not know the landscape there in Northeast Ohio. So it made a lot of sense to find a local partner, a local foundation who did know the players, who did have those relationships, and we found the Burton D. Morgan Foundation. So the stars basically aligned there. We both contributed $1.6 million over 3 years, so it was a $3.2 million commitment altogether to bring our Blackstone Launchpad program to Northeast Ohio, four universities there: Kent State, Lorain County Community College, Baldwin Wallace, and Case Western Reserve University. I was testing myself there to make sure I remember all the universities. And as a catalytic funder, as a corporate funder, we aren't in these regions for the long term. So finding a local partner, a local foundation there on the ground, actually helps sustain these programs over the long term. So as Deb referenced earlier, as Blackstone's funding trailed off toward the end of the third and fourth year, Burton D. Morgan stepped up, renamed the program there the NEO LaunchNet for Northeast Ohio, but essentially it's the core of it, essentially Blackstone Launchpad, and it still continues to this day there at those 4 universities. So that was a successful partnership that we had with them.
Talk a little bit about how you structured that partnership, and was it just something somebody decided where to spend money and you guys funded it together? Did you guys work together on what the priorities were? How did you guys work together? What was the relationship like?
So essentially, we had our own interests in terms of what we wanted to accomplish with Blackstone Launchpad, and still to this day. We are very much focused on the economic development impact of our program. So, and as you can imagine, the senior leadership of the firm is very interested in the economic development impact of the program. So we are looking for jobs, we are looking for business formation, we're looking for how many people are actually being touched by the program, the level of engagement. Burton D. Morgan was interested in those metrics as well, but they were interested more in the educational piece. So there at the universities, what was the educational experience from a program like Blackstone Launchpad? How can that be translated back to the university leaders to ensure that they can demonstrate the impact and success of the program? So it was a nice combination. You know, there were folks on both sides that were managing the program, but in terms of our interest aligning, you know, Blackstone Launchpad, it helped us achieve both, which was nice. And I think that is the one risk when it comes to co-funding a program together, is ensuring that both foundations, or even more than two, that interests align. And it's hard sometimes to actually find that common ground. And very often it doesn't work. We've talked to other foundations and they're interested in X and we're interested in Y. Doesn't mean that they're wrong, we're right, or vice versa. It just means that, you know, we can't be partners on this one project. So I think really having that honest conversation initially, trying to figure out what are they interested in, what are we interested in, and do those interests align.
Hey, Sarah, you want to talk about some or a collaboration?
Yeah, I'd love to. And what I'll do is maybe a comparison of, you know, there's the big, we're both putting in, you know, $1 million+ grant funding types of things. But I also want to encourage people to look for collaborations in a lot of the small places as well. And not to say that our collaboration last year with you guys was small in any terms, but we at the Case Foundation, you know, one of the ways that we're trying to build and catalyze the inclusive entrepreneurship movement is through something we call inspiration capital. And that's really the culture change that needs to happen about the way that we talk about entrepreneurship, who we represent as successful entrepreneurs, you know, who is on stage saying, you know, this is how entrepreneurship has changed my life, who's on the cover of magazines, you know, who do investors actually see as the legitimate investment opportunities. And we know that that's not actually all of the people who, you know, could be on the cover of the magazines, could be on stage, could be invested in. And so when we're trying to change that through storytelling, through influencing, we decided, and it was, you know, the first thing that we did within our inclusive entrepreneurship movement was to do a campaign where we were calling on entrepreneurs to actually share their stories with us, so we could help to get those stories out there. And we ran 5 stories in Fast Company and then launched a Medium publication where we can put even more stories out there. And we were first planning this, you know, the biggest thing for us, especially anytime we do prizes and challenges, regardless if there's a monetary prize, is that we know if we only go out to our network, we're just going to get the same thing we'd get if we send out an email. And so if we want to reach beyond those people that we have direct access to, you know, even with the advent of social media and all of the different ways that you can get the word out there, the best way to me is through partnerships, especially with people who don't work necessarily exactly in the same space as you. And so we partnered with Blackstone, with UBS, and with Google for Entrepreneurs. We're all positioned in kind of different spaces and different places along the inclusive entrepreneurship spectrum. Project Entrepreneur was looking, through UBS, was looking a lot more at women. Blackstone was just starting to get into inclusive and looking at a lot of different geographies. Google for Entrepreneur had a lot of access into the traditional mainstream entrepreneurship avenues. And, you know, through that partnership, we were able to reach so many more people than we ever imagined. And the quality of submissions that we got was completely off the charts. Because I will say, at the very beginning, you never know when you put out an open call, whether it's a grant or whether it's prizes and challenges, of what you're going to get back. You always hope for the best. But we figured at least we'll get 5 good ones. And the fact that we got so many more than 5 that we wanted to figure out other channels that we could put those stories out there and lift up those entrepreneurs was really incredible for us. And having those partners alongside who said, this is valuable, this is something we want to spend our time on, and not just funding. And something that it was okay, was a short-term, discrete opportunity, you know, definitely helped to build the partnerships down the road too. Yes.
You know, one of the things Kaufman is in the tail end phases of making some decisions around what we called our inclusion challenge grants. And we sent out a request for proposal, we sent out an RFP. We got almost 800 responses to it from organizations around the United States that focus on inclusion work. So we actually have, and as my colleagues go through and vet these things, we will have an extraordinary index of resources for organizations that focus on inclusion around the United States. And since I'm just the lawyer, I'm not on the program side, feel free to connect with my colleagues.
Well, John, I was going to put you on the spot, and even if you're not a program person, I'm wondering if you have any collaboration ideas of, when you get a list like that in, it doesn't have to be what specifically is Kaufman going to do with that list, but do you or any other panelists, I'm just taking over your moderator role now, sorry, but do you have ideas of how we could share deal flow, and especially if there's a runners-up list, you'll publish the people that you do fund, but how can we be better at saying, hey, we wish that we could fund these other 10 organizations, do you want to reach out to any, do I pass them to you under the table, do we email them back and forth, have you seen any good models for that?
I'm not sure that I've seen any good models, but that is something that is very much top of mind for us, as recognizing that we do have colleagues in philanthropy that work with entrepreneurship and inclusive entrepreneurship in particular, and we're not going to be able to fund the 700 awesome ideas that we're getting. And maybe not all 700 are awesome, but we do look forward, and it is part of our thinking and our processing of being intentional about, those that we fund, people will know about. But getting with that next tranche, and I don't know how big that next tranche is, being intentional about both letting that tranche know and letting some of our funder colleagues know that these folks are out there and that they can have some real impact as well. I know that that's something that MacArthur, with its 100 and change initiative, $100 million to one organization, and I know from their planning and their execution, which is part of the reason I think that they, publicly identified the 10 or 15 sort of quarterfinalists before they got down to the final 4, so that people would know that was an extensive process, and a good way for to publicly say these are 10, 15 organizations that have made it through quite a ringer, and so hoping that foundations will pick up on some of that. We haven't cracked that nut yet, but it is something we're trying to do. Debbie, collaborations, you've kind of teed that topic off. You want to go deeper?
Sure, it's something that I think about all the time. So the organization in Israel, Startup Nation Central, actually thrives on building relationships and partnerships, and its goal really is to find the right leaders all around the world, and create meaningful substantive relationships. And actually also within Israel, they're doing a lot of interesting work to partner with some of the larger companies, and this is something I know we'll get into later, but there's some challenges in Israel, which many of you have talked about today, which is access to human capital and making sure that you have you're working with the right populations internally to pull in workers from diverse populations, and this is something that we're thinking about quite a bit. So to even access the populations, to access the companies in Israel, we need to develop partnerships with the critical strategic players in Israel. From a funding perspective, when we started to, we started this organization. It was an idea. We created the organization. We basically spent 3 years testing it and figuring out if the idea was something that was real before we brought on funding partners and wasted anybody else's money. It's okay to waste Paul's, but nobody else's. And the way that we really thought about partnerships was, who are people who we share values with, who care about entrepreneurship, economic growth, innovation, Israel, but also who would come on not just as a funding partner, but as a thought partner who could help us expand that reach, expand our impact, bring access that we don't necessarily have. We thought about it from a geographical standpoint. We now have 5 partners who are based in California, Chicago, Detroit, London, and Atlanta, so it's a nice geographic spread. We wanted people from both sides of the political aisle. Entrepreneurship and innovation is not political. It shouldn't be. And I happen to work for a politically polarizing individual, so it was really important to me that we bring on some people from the other side. and create lasting relationships. And I can, very specific example actually, while we were talking to the William Davidson Foundation, one of their grantees is based here in Detroit, the Henry Ford healthcare system, specifically their Center for Innovation. And I was sort of looking on their website, and I was reading about this incredible center that is looking for innovation, and I just realized, like, this is what partnership is about. And I was able to to connect with Henry Ford, with the Davidsons, and really triangulate this incredible relationship. Henry Ford had absolutely no connection whatsoever to Israeli innovation. Their center is all about solving problems with new, exciting sort of technologies. And they came over to Israel, Startup Nation Central introduced them to a whole bunch of innovation in digital health, which is a really important sector to Israel. It matched up perfectly with Henry Ford. William Davidson was able to sort of bring everybody together, and since then the Henry Ford Center for Innovation has become a real strategic partner for Startup Nation, not only bringing Israeli innovation back to Michigan, but actually bringing problems to Israel. So we solve the problem of, you got a whole bunch of entrepreneurs in Israel who think they're going to create the next app. Well, we don't want them to just spin their wheels. We want to bring real world problems to them. So how are we going to access some of the biggest healthcare systems in America? How do we access some of the people who are looking at agricultural and water challenges? How do we get to people who are thinking about some of the challenges in financial technologies to reach people in India who want to, have credit card transactions? Like there are so many different things that we, the Paul Singer Foundation, can't reach, but through strategic partnerships, we can actually access some of the world's greatest problems and help solve them together.
One of the things, and Joe asked this question earlier of the panel before us, that all of us have hit on sort of around the edges, but I want to go ahead and put it out front and center. And I semi-regularly have this conversation with my colleagues in the entrepreneurship team at Kaufman, and it begins with, that's an awesome idea, but entrepreneurship isn't charitable. So what we do as foundations still has to be charitable. And from my standpoint, Mr. Kaufman said, donor intent, you will do entrepreneurship. And part of the joy that I get to have is helping solve the problems for how is this wonderful creative idea to work with entrepreneurs and work around entrepreneurship. How do we make sure that we can do it and still keep our exempt status? And in some ways, the three of you have some advantages because you've got either living donors or a corporation that you can make decisions, okay, foundation's going to do this, the other side of the house or different side of the house is going to do that. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, how do you make those decisions, and how do you wrestle with charitability? Or maybe you don't, and off you go. So what do you think? Debbie, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. We get asked all the time, why don't you charge for your services? I mean, at this point, we are doing things that a company arguably could do. We've mapped out the whole innovation ecosystem. We have this database which is free, online, with over 5,500 entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, innovators, and it's open source. We hope people will access this database. And most databases, you have to spend a lot of money to get this information. Part of the work that we're doing is actually bringing in Fortune 500 company CEOs and providing basically a roadshow, introductions to the most relevant entrepreneurs on the ground that will bring value to a for-profit company. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we're not charging them for that. So they say, why? So the answer is multiple fold. Number one, we want to be completely unbiased. Paul does not invest in any of these companies. He only invests in his hedge fund, and so we have absolutely no bias on the companies that you're going to meet. So a venture capitalist will be happy to charge you to meet his portfolio companies in any place in the world. Mm-hmm. Government is not doing this. The government of Israel, governments all over the place, they have to worry about the pressing problems of today. It's a crisis. Like, this is not a crisis that the government has to address. So the government can't do it. And frankly, we like the ability to not charge so that we can choose which are the strategic problems we want to work on. We don't want to be beholden to the guy who's going to pay us the most money to introduce them to things that are going to bring value. We want to say, this is what the entrepreneurial ecosystem needs to thrive and to continue and and actually to grow. We know the sectors that are most relevant, and we know the countries that are most relevant. You know, somebody wants to access Israeli cybersecurity, that's great. There are about 1,000 people who can help you out. We're not going to spend our philanthropic dollars helping to promote that sector so people know about it. So it gives us maximum flexibility, and we protect that sort of philanthropic role very carefully.
Yeah, as you can imagine, for Blackstone, it was a big discussion very early on when we decided to focus on entrepreneurship. I think, you know, first of all, the lawyers and our public affairs team immediately said, wait a minute, entrepreneurship, how is that a charitable activity? How are you going to approach this? Because I think in their minds, and we've had to deal with this since announcing our entrepreneurship initiative, is wait a minute, you know, Blackstone's just doing this to create the next generation of companies that they could either take a stake in or buy at a later date and profit off of their charitable work. Not the case. So, you know, we structured the foundation very early on, and we're very explicit with our grants and with our programs that, one, we would not provide capital to the entrepreneurs, which is a very difficult conversation to have with many of them, because they immediately think, oh, Blackstone, you're going to give me seed capital or an angel investment or something. That's off the table. No, our grant funding supports the programs that support the entrepreneurs, so there's a wall there. Two, you know, we are very much, even though we are focused on the economic development impact of our programs, the narrative we really like to push out, you know, one being a catalytic funder, is how are we strengthening the ecosystem of a region, and how are we tracking that? Because, you know, if our programs do what they are supposed to do, once our grant funding leaves, once our program winds down, the ecosystem should be stronger there in that region, and entrepreneurs there will benefit. So again, we're not profiting off of that at all. But as you can imagine, very early on, those discussions were very front of mind for us when embarking on this entrepreneurship initiative.
Sarah?
Yeah, so our approach is very similar to what Debbie and Tony have laid out, and very focused on ecosystem building, right, of how do we support the organizations that support entrepreneurs and ensure that they have all of the resources that they need around them. The one thing that I'll add from our experience, just in case it's helpful for anybody in the room that's trying to, you know, go through that decision of, do we do just grant making, do we do a combination of grant making and investments? We've done PRIs before as well through the foundation, and you know, the justification process of doing that was obviously much easier when it was a social entrepreneur, and we can say they are creating social good. It's a little bit more complicated when we're talking about inclusive entrepreneurship and, you know, the value that they're going to bring. Though the companies that come forward as the best investments tend to be both inclusive entrepreneurs and social good companies, because we think that those are going to, you know, be the ones that, you know, are actually kind of on the forefront of creating change and creating good returns. But what we found out, and this goes back to some of how John started to explain how the Case Foundation is set up, you know, we have the foundation, we have the venture capital firm, and then we have the Case's individual investments. And with young, living, active donors and founders of the foundation who also do their own personal investing, the amount of time and burden that we were putting on the entrepreneurs to go through the process of a PRI versus the very quick term sheet that our founders could do personally is a tough decision for us sometimes, because we want the entrepreneurs to have what they need the most and to put the least burden on them. But as soon as it flips over to that personal side, the foundation then can't use them as an example. We can't talk about them in the same ways that we would lift up other things, because if us lifting them up creates a better situation for them, that creates financial benefit for the Cases as individuals, then we are in a really, really tricky spot with the IRS. So, you know, those decisions of balancing the needs of the entrepreneurs with the value that the Case Foundation can bring to them versus the value that the Cases individually can bring to them is one of those constant conversations and struggles that we have, which ends up less as a legal conversation and more as a strategic conversation. So I think both are involved.
Yeah, and the practical sides of it, you know, and Sarah, you've hit on this, I think, very nicely. And even with just regular grant making to 501c3s, you've got due diligence that really needs to be commensurate with the the burden needs to be commensurate with the benefit.
Yeah.
And not only in the due diligence, but in the ongoing reporting and the milestones and those sorts of things. And entrepreneurs, I think, are particularly attuned to that because they are perhaps more so, they're making decisions about opportunity costs, not just for the money, but for the time. And as funders, we're making those decisions as well. And oftentimes we're looking at the bang for the buck, which means we're then looking at the impact. And we've all talked about ecosystems as part of it. We've all talked about impact, but how do you get to ground level for measuring impact, for assessing, are you changing ecosystems or perhaps changing a life or lives, and is changing a life enough? Or does it have to be changing the world? So on one hand, that's a high level esoteric question, but I'm more interested in the ground level. So Sarah, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I will start because I guarantee that everyone's answer will be more fulfilling than mine. Measurement and evaluation is hard always. Measurement and evaluation in the entrepreneurship sector we've found to be particularly complicated. And so we've created a system that I'm really excited about at the foundation that's a little bit new for us, where we're thinking about our work as contributing to a movement where we aren't the only players in the movement. And that's how we pick which strategic area that we're going to focus on next is there a movement that is already starting, that already has some early people backing it, that we can come in and help to move faster? And so for us, it's not always saying what attribution can the Case Foundation claim. Like, we individually help to achieve X, Y, and Z, though that's very important a lot of times in the nonprofit sector. We're coming at it and saying, what have we contributed toward in the movement? How has the work that we and all of the others done to help move the movement forward? And so what we're looking at more is indicators of what's happening big picture in inclusive entrepreneurship. You know, are we seeing more media coverage of diverse entrepreneurs? Are we seeing the narrative of how people talk about entrepreneurship starting to include a lot of other people? Are we seeing some standardized data being used across the board to explain why this is an issue and get people's attention and better understanding of, you know, why we're even in this space? Are we seeing more ecosystems start to come together and focus on inclusion as opposed to just broad entrepreneurship that's still favoring a smaller group of people? And so those don't have to be things that the Case Foundation says, we did that, but things that we want to see are accelerating and moving faster, and that we can say, we hope that we had some part in that, but we don't need to say that it was because of us.
Well, and that last point ties into something that Miriam Nolan said this morning about trying to get to causation. There were a lot of things that came together around Detroit that started this momentum that needs to continue. And looking at assessment, and particularly in entrepreneurship, I agree with the thing you said right at the beginning. Measurement is hard. It's even harder, I think, in the entrepreneurship space. It's especially hard if you're trying to get to causal relationships as opposed to correlations or even strong suspicions. So Tony.
Yes, so metrics, I hate talking about metrics because it is so hard to...
You're welcome.
Maybe Debbie will like this.
Hopefully you'll save me at the end.
It's a lot of pressure.
One thing that I did find comforting, though, about the discussion with metrics, so thanks to Kaufman and Case Foundation and others, other funders of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, we actually came together earlier this year, and I actually led the conversation regarding for metrics, and it was so comforting to be in a room with other funders of entrepreneurs talking about metrics, and nobody had the answer. So we were all like, you know, just at a basic level, like, what system do you use to like just track it? And it was so nice to hear that people also used like Google Sheets and you know and Excel spreadsheets, and there wasn't like this fancy system even just to track the metrics. So if you're thinking about how to do this, don't worry. No, there's no silver bullet out there.
Sounds like an entrepreneurial opportunity.
It sounds like an entrepreneur. Yeah, if there's an entrepreneur out there that wants to tackle this, that would be.
Or if any of you want to solve it, please tell us.
This is where the collaboration and partnership piece comes in. But I think when talking about metrics too, for us, as a corporate foundation, we are unique. So it really does depend on your stakeholders. Sort of what are they most interested in hearing and seeing, and regarding the impact of your program. So the 4 things that we look at for our metrics: 1, the economic development, which I've already discussed. That's pretty straightforward. 2 is the strengthening of the ecosystem, and that's sort of a squishy metric, and believe me, my senior leadership has said that to me before. So we talk about connections, sort of as a result of our program, how many people are now engaged, how many of these people that are engaged are meeting one another either at events or meetings or whatnot, coaching sessions. And we try to make that argument that those, as a result of those connections, the ecosystem is strengthening. The 3rd thing we look at is PR and success stories. Like to your point of what is the tangible impact of our program in the region? How has X entrepreneur benefited? Have they hired somebody? Has their revenue increased? We like to highlight those stories. And the 4th thing that I touched on earlier, like I said, as a catalytic funder, we're only there for a short period of time. Our success is really tied to the long-term viability of our programs that we're supporting in these regions. So are they sustainable? Are other funders stepping in to sustain the programs? Are universities stepping up to the plate and saying, yes, Blackstone Launchpad is of value. We will continue funding it directly from our budgets. So that's really, like I said, going back to who are your stakeholders and what stories do they want to hear. Those are the 4 broad categories that we're focused on when tracking our programs. So hopefully it works for some of you.
So just a personal aside, 15 years ago I started my career as an investment banker, and then I sort of went into nonprofits as a fluke. And the first thing I did is I sat with the CEO and I started building out my spreadsheets. I was like, okay, let's do our 5-year growth plan and let's make sure that we can predict all these little numbers. And he looked at me like I had 10 heads. And it's still something I kind of fight back, and I love spreadsheets and I love maps, and I really am a very quantitative thinker. So I'm always trying to push some sort of quantitative measurement. However, I've learned over the years that so much of philanthropy is not quantitative, and it's good that we can't say this is exactly how we measure, because if we could, then in our minds at the Paul Singer Foundation, philanthropy is largely risk capital. And when you're putting up risk capital, it's a risk. And so you have to balance risk versus like what can we really put into an Excel spreadsheet. So that's at the foundation broadly. We have a lot of different projects. We probably fund 60 different grantees, and each one arguably has different measures. We try and group them together and think about sort of ecosystem growth, or like sort of a field, and how are we advancing the field. Specifically with Startup Nation Central, which is a very complicated organization, because we're trying to do basically 3 major things. One is to do, and broadly, it's to protect the economic security of a country, which can then be translated to a city. Like, how do you measure the value of what you're doing in Detroit? So number 1, are we opening up markets to them? And that's actually a relatively easy thing to measure. How many dates and how many marriages have we had? How many companies have we brought? And has it resulted in tech transfers? Has it resulted in innovation centers being set up in Israel, R&D centers? How many entrepreneurs have we sent off to the strategic countries that we've mapped out? And actually, Tony, a lot of your measures, I was writing them down because they sort of matched up with mine. It is economic growth, it's ecosystem, it's PR, and it's the long-term viability. But there's also a time frame. Some of these things take a very long time to realize, and so you have to be patient. Like some of the companies or organizations we work with can't pull a trigger. There's a long process, even though they had the most successful time on the ground. 2 years later, we hear an incredible success story, so you have to be patient. In terms of the ecosystem itself, it's been very, very interesting. When we started this, we really were thinking about more the external connections, dates and marriages, but as we've gone along, a lot has changed within Israel and in the world, and there are new challenges to the ecosystem's sustainability and viability. Part of that is continuing to open up markets. Part of it is actually working with the entrepreneurs to prepare them for international conversations. I mean, Israel actually kind of functions as an island economy. It's surrounded on one side by water and the other side by unfriendly neighbors, and so really most of their business is overseas. And the high-tech business actually accounts for 50% of Israel's exports. It's actually only 18% of GDP, or only, but it's largely reliant on that external relationship. That being said, it's grown tremendously, and the ability to continue to feed this ecosystem is at risk. So what I mean by that is it's back to the human capital piece. So there just aren't enough skilled workers to fill the jobs that are being created by this high-tech ecosystem. And the Israeli government predicts that in the next 5 years, they expect shortages of up to 10,000 workers. This is a country that's the state of New Jersey. So 10,000 empty jobs is a lot of jobs to fill. You may have read about the recent acquisition by Mobileye, this driverless technology by Intel. Mobileye is based in Jerusalem. They expect in Jerusalem alone a shortage of 3,000 jobs. So one of the things that we've taken on at Startup Nation is we know all of the startups, or most of the startups and the innovators and the R&D centers. We're starting to say to them, look, if you guys want to stay in Israel, we want you to stay. We need you to stay. This is the largest driver of economic growth. Without you, Israel's economy will fall apart. Therefore, we need to make sure that you stay here. So what do we need to do to make sure that you don't go to Ireland or Berlin or to many of the other entrepreneurial ecosystems that are now starting to pop up all over the world who are actively courting these Israeli engineers? So we're now starting to think as a foundation, how can we put money to work to access some of the unskilled workers? Can we train them? I mean, we're looking, yes, of course, you have to look at education. K through 12 education is incredibly important, but that's not going to solve Mobileye's problems next year.
Right.
What do I do about the ultra-Orthodox religious people living in Jerusalem who 52% live in poverty, make up 11% of the country's workforce, and are actively not participating in the workforce? That's a problem. It's also an opportunity. Same with the Arab community. 20% of Israel's population are Israeli Arabs, yet they don't have the access to the networks and to the education or to the training programs or to the boot camps that will get them to the jobs. Conversely, the companies don't have access to them. Like there's some companies that say, Cisco is a great example, they're very open to hiring Arab Israelis, that's great, but they don't know how to reach them. So we're trying to match the needs of the employers to the needs of these various sort of human capital untapped pools. What do we need to do to get the workers prepared, and what do we need to do to get the companies open-minded and actually fill those jobs so that the economy doesn't collapse? So that's a really long answer, but basically there are a lot of measures and metrics that I've thrown out. I can't say to the success that we are going to meet those, but we know that those are real numbers. That we're now working with different organizations saying, you're doing a great job, you trained 450 people in high skilled jobs, but we want 1,000 next year, and we want 10,000 next, so that's how we're sort of thinking about it.
Well, and there certainly are tremendous gaps in the United States as well about the need for high-tech workers and even low-tech workers, plumbers, welders, fabulous opportunities actually to be entrepreneurs as well. And Debbie, what you're talking about as far as Israel and the outreach to Arab Israelis, it's a different approach to inclusion than what we've been discussing or what we normally think about with a US-centric model. Open up to questions. Do you all have questions for our panel? I'm perfectly prepared to ask more of them, but suspect you all would like to know some things. Yes, Livia.
So, hi, I'm Livia Brockman from the Ralph Wilson Foundation here in Detroit. And this has been talked about a little bit earlier on some of the other panels, but as you talk about the strategic challenges, and all of you have mentioned the importance of strengthening the ecosystem, I'm wondering what you think about when there's place-based investment by philanthropy, how important it is to think about sector kinds of investments. And the reason I'm asking that question is I've worked in a number of different, sometimes called weak market cities, Detroit, Cleveland, other places, where a lot of what philanthropy is doing is sort of helping fill a gap left by, the auto industry, the steel industry, whatever it was that has gone away. And so I kind of wonder, how you think about when you're talking about strengthening an ecosystem, what role does thinking about things in terms of sector play and leading towards a diversified economy through those kinds of investments?
Yeah, you do a little more place-based than we do.
Yeah, so I guess I'll tackle that one. So I mean, all of our work is place-based, it's regionally focused, but I'll use Colorado as an example of how we address that issue there. So like I said, we worked very closely with the leaders there in that region to identify sort of what the gaps were there that we could address. And we worked specifically, I have to credit Senator Michael Bennett's office. He was instrumental in helping us stand up what is now the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network program there. By bringing together the thought leaders there in that region, they were able to identify what the biggest gap was. And to your point regarding sectors, they actually identified geography within Colorado and the issue of sectors there as something that we could help address. So from a geographic perspective, they made the argument saying Boulder there is great when it comes to entrepreneurial activity. There's a lot of stuff happening there. Denver is on an upswing, but they basically said Fort Collins and Colorado Springs, the larger metro area there, completely left out. Your program needs to help us address that. So that's what Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network is doing on the geographic front. On the sector front, they actually said to us, the tech sector, especially in Boulder again, is very robust. We have a lot of great companies there. We have a lot of funders there. But there are so many other sectors within Colorado that are lacking. They specifically, I'm testing myself here, they identified 4 different sectors. I think I can probably get 2 or 3. Aerospace, natural foods, I want to say healthcare, and there's one more. It's on the website if you go to Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network, Colorado.com, to look them all up, or Ben Colorado, I think we shortened it. And they wanted the program to address bringing those, essentially standing up those other sectors and linking it better to the tech sector, because tech touches all in the other sectors. I mean, many of the companies within the other sectors are tech enabled, so they saw a real opportunity in terms of bridging the divide between those sectors together. And essentially that's what our program is doing there. I don't know if that answers your specific question in terms of how sector specific we need to be when going to a region, but we really do listen to the leaders there on the ground in terms of what they need the most.
Yeah, I mean, I would add we actually have a very similar approach. I mean, think of New Jersey, but a very far distance from here. But when we look at Israel, we think of the different cities. Right now, Tel Aviv is where most of the tech and entrepreneurship is sort of centered. You have a little bit in the Tel Aviv areas. Jerusalem is now emerging as a tech center, Haifa. But there's a lot of talk also about what's happening in the peripheries of Israel and thinking about the different cities and places that we can sort of juice up, if you will, entrepreneurial activity. Who are the right partners to go into these different cities with? I think from Startup Nation's perspective, it's very much sector driven. As I mentioned a little earlier, when we hired the CEO, he actually was the Prime Minister's senior economic advisor. So he comes in as an economist, and he understands from a very macroeconomic perspective what are the sectors that are really strong in this country. And we know because of who he is, and we know because of the database, we can track the number of companies that are in the database in digital health. We can track the ones in agriculture. We can track in water. And you can say, okay, well, these are the sectors where there's a lot of activity in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. But the entrepreneurs aren't they're not focused on external markets, or they're all in the universities and they don't know how to commercialize the work that they're doing. Or this sector is very well connected, and so that helps inform where we want to spend time. Similarly, what countries are important trading partners for our economy. And I think these are all lessons that are completely transferable to a state or a city here in America. Just thinking strategically, not just where can we really help create and catalyze activity in sectors and geographies where you just don't see the activity that can and should be happening. And part of that is really just the mapping process. And I would add, actually, which could be relevant to some folks here, we're now starting to work with other cities and countries all over the world who are also interested in building a similar database. It's called the Finder, and we're now expanding it to what we call Global Finder. We built one in Ireland. We're working with Australia and New Zealand, Chicago. We're just in conversations with Detroit, where we want them to use the methodology that we've created to map out all the entrepreneurs and then have them all connected. So somebody earlier today talked about, how do you invest locally, but you have a global competition. We think technology and having sort of this Finder like database can help create more efficiencies.
And I'll go ahead and chime in on behalf of the foundation as well. We don't focus on sectors when we go in, and a lot of the ecosystem building work that we're doing is very much looking at grassroots aspects to things. So for instance, our 1 Million Cups program, which is now in about 150 cities, we started the program, but we didn't export it. It was imported. So there's entrepreneurial community in Chattanooga that wants to do 1 Million Cups. So we work with them for how to do that, and then we work with now 150 communities on doing that. And it's intentionally sector agnostic, in part because we see a lot of value in cross-sector pollination and natural relationships and natural opportunities that have to exist, and complementarity that has to exist for sectors to grow. And we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to, with any given sector, go in and say, you should do this and you would grow. We know that there are some people who do know some of those things, and we will help them when it's appropriate, but we're not saying it.
So I'm Liz Markey from Montana, and there are 88 million people in America that live in rural America. And my question to you is, numbers, metrics. It's much easier to get a lot in New York City and not so much in, Miles City, Montana. Are any of you specifically looking at opportunities in rural America that can scale both, in the heartland and internationally in the entrepreneurial? Because we sort of believe that in a world where geography doesn't matter because of technology, all that matters is geography. So just speak to that.
Well, why don't I start? And I will say that my first plug is not with my foundation hat on, it's with my other hat, is that Steve Case, in his role as CEO of Revolution, the venture capital firm, is very committed to trying to figure out how do you build entrepreneurship ecosystems in places outside the coasts. And the stat that he always uses is that 75% of venture capital goes to California, Massachusetts, and New York. Yeah. And so if the other 47 states are trying to divide up 25% of the money, it's no surprise that there's not as much entrepreneurship activity, not necessarily happening, but scaling in those other locations. And so he is about on Tuesday to go on the 6th Rise of the Rest tour, where he literally takes a bus, and I'm usually with him, but I'm not going to make the one next week, and goes to 5 different cities talking about how national attention can help that city, but also how they need to build better relationships within. And one of the biggest things is how do you get investors who made their money in that market to invest back into it? Right. And we usually would kick it off with an investor breakfast where we get a little bit, not rough, but honest with some of the investors and, ask, okay, raise your hand if you made your money here, raise your hand if you invest a significant amount of your capital here. And usually on that second question, you have like one person who's raising their hand. And so I think there's some clear things like that, both from national funders and national organizations being more intentional about going to cities other than the big, urban centers on the coast, but also figuring out how we can better support those cities to build within themselves and to figure out what are the specific resources that, the heartland cities or, rural communities communities need to be successful. The last plug I'll make is for Telluride Foundation and the work that they're doing in rural entrepreneurship. Mark Nagar used to run Up Global and is now over there, and I think they're being incredibly thoughtful about how can rural entrepreneurship balance both the Main Street businesses and high growth potential businesses, and how they can take that and make it work in Telluride and across the country.
We've done some work in rural economies, including Montana. I have to give a plug to our programs in Montana. We have our Blackstone Launchpad programs there at Montana State University and the University of Montana. I would say that is something that we are looking at beyond just our university program. In our work, which is primarily national in nature, we do have this view of what's happening in many different regions across the country, and the discussions happening in those regions. And there is this huge discussion, not only for the cities that are like a Nashville or a Memphis, cities that are not New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, but these are big cities for those particular states. I think one thing that you're talking about, what about the regions, the ex-urban communities and the even smaller communities farther out? How do you support entrepreneurs in those places? We haven't cracked the code. I know there's a lot of great things happening across the country. One program that we are not supporting yet, but are looking at closely. Again, I'll plug Colorado again, because I think Colorado is doing a lot of interesting things. So led actually by Governor Hickenlooper there in Colorado, working closely with Brad Feld, who I'm sure everybody is familiar with. Brad's big passion now is how do you support these communities like Telluride, like Aspen, like Grand Junction there in Colorado, that have entrepreneurs but don't have the density to really justify a program like a Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network, where there's a paid staff member and regular events. How do you connect them? So we're in preliminary conversations. Could Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network in Denver, Boulder serve as a hub, and then either through technology or other means do we reach out to those other communities and try to stitch that together? And my vision is hopefully that would go further out and touch Wyoming, Montana, and other communities there in the Intermountain West. But that's my own. I'm speaking just for myself. That's not really a Blackstone initiative yet, but I'm pushing it though.
From our perspective, first of all, we do want to connect to some of the companies and government leaders and NGO leaders who are in the middle of the country who don't feel that they have access to innovation for a variety of reasons. Also, we have a lot of requests from people who are interested in learning from the Israeli sort of entrepreneurial ecosystem to understand why it's good. Like why does it exist, and what lessons can I take back to my community? So we do welcome leaders of governments, organizations who want to come and have exposure to the governors or experts in Israel, so government officials, industry experts, whoever's most relevant to, let's say you wanted to bring a bunch of agricultural leaders from, pick a state, any of the states, and say they're really looking to build the innovation in this space, both whether it's for some of the small farmers or some of the large corporations, and they need an injection of innovation because everybody's fleeing for Silicon Valley or whatever, or they're just dying because they're getting out innovated by the big guys. I'd be happy to talk to you offline, but we're always thinking of ways that we want people to learn from Israel and connect to Israel, and I think to the extent we can help catalyze activity in American sort of towns, that would be great.
There are a couple things that Kaufman is doing with regard to rural. One is the Inclusion Challenge, and this is the second round of Inclusion Challenge. The first Inclusion grants a year or so ago. In both instances, we identified race, gender, and geography as part of what inclusion means. And in some ways, our theme or meme or tagline is zero barriers. Zero barriers to entry for entrepreneurs, for people with idea, for people who want to be entrepreneurs, for people who should be entrepreneurs but they don't know that they should. The barriers to doing that ought to be taken down. And in a lot of ways that means geography, and it means rural locations. And so some of the grant making that we've done and will do in this Inclusion Challenge will be to organizations that focus on rural entrepreneurship. In some instances, it's taking successful programs that want to expand into rural areas. In other cases, it's organizations that focus on rural activities. That's one. Two, Sarah mentioned the venture capital gap, and there's a huge chasm in the middle of the country as far as venture capital. Austin, Texas gets some, but beyond that, there's not a lot. We've actually funded a program that we started some 25 years ago, the Kaufman Fellows Program, a program that we began to teach people about how to be a venture capitalist. And it's now spun out, it's independent, it operates separately from us, but we still support it. We've set up 4 scholarships over the next 3 years for people in this middle part of the country to become Kaufman Fellows and to go through this experience of learning how to be venture capitalists, with some hope that what that will do is then help bring some of the venture capital activity back into this middle part of the country. I'd also want to give a plug. I know the Blandon Foundation out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Otto Bremer Foundations out of St. Paul are doing work in rural areas that their philanthropy covers. Rural Minnesota and South Dakota, North Dakota. So there are activities there that they're trying to spur entrepreneurship in rural communities. Any other questions? I know we're pushing time, so if not, let me ask you all, what's sort of a final thought for folks here who are philanthropists who want to support entrepreneurship? And your thoughts will be the final ones that close out the conference. So
The pressure's on.
Other than Joe.
So who wants to go first?
Ooh, I'll go first so I don't have to go last. So I think for me, some of the biggest takeaways today are that there is a huge community of other funders who are committed to thinking about how entrepreneurship is creating change within communities, whether that's social entrepreneurship, inclusive entrepreneurship, or entrepreneurship generally. If you are just getting started, find your peers, learn from other people, ask questions. Don't be afraid to get into some of that sticky stuff that we talked about earlier of like, how do you actually talk to your board about this? And where do I draw the line and how far that I can go? And hopefully that we can all learn from each other. And I hope that you find the Case Foundation as an ally and a partner. And please, reach out to me, reach out to us if there's anything that we can do or anything that you have to be a part of, or you also want John's list of inclusive entrepreneurship grantees.
So 2 takeaways and sort of lessons learned. Again, if you're just getting in the entrepreneurship space funding, one, when choosing where to donate, and I'll focus on universities since it seems pretty relevant. Do not just focus on a Harvard, a Yale, a Stanford. I know people are inclined to support these big premier universities and support entrepreneurs there. A lot of community colleges need support. A lot of state schools need support. A lot of liberal arts schools need support. They would love some funding to support their entrepreneurs. And related to that, another lesson learned too, from what I've seen from a lot of foundations and donors too, donors love to make a splash, go to university, go to a new place, and slap their name on like a building or a program, which is great. But one thing that I've noticed in working with many universities is programs tend to get duplicative. So because universities are chasing after donors and chasing after foundations, they'll say, we'll name this after you, we'll name that after you. I think it's up to you as a donor, it's you as a foundation to ask those tough questions, sort of where does this program you want me to fund, where does it fit within your ecosystem there at the university to support your entrepreneur? Is it duplicative? Like, can it be linked to something else and use my name for something else? So like I think it's something. It's like asking those tough questions to understand how your funding, donor funding, foundation funding will be used at that university to impact entrepreneurs, and being thoughtful about it, I think is really key.
First of all, I like how you just went second. Like, you just assumed that you would have a chance.
I thought we were going down the line, actually. So.
You can make John finish.
I will say something.
So actually, this morning, Andrew Yang said in his opening remarks that entrepreneurs are crazy. That may or may not be true. In Israel, we say that entrepreneurs and Israelis generally have chutzpah. There's a word for this, and there's no really good translation. And there are a lot of reasons why entrepreneurship is existing and it thrives in Israel, why it's under some sort of threat, and why we need to sort of stay focused on it. So all I would say is if you are at all interested in learning more, our foundation loves to partner. I love to meet new people. We love to think creatively. I would invite you and leaders of the organizations that you work with in your networks to learn more about what's happening in Israel. And I'm happy to think creatively about ways that we can sort of give you a more immersive experience, and you can bring back lessons to the communities where you are. So, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, you all are here because you're interested in doing something with your philanthropies in entrepreneurship, and I think that's fantastic, and I, like my colleagues up here, encourage you to do it. There are 1,001 and more ways to engage, and how you engage will be meaningful, it will be impactful, it will make a difference. And there are folks, as you've heard, very willing, and not just up here, but throughout the day and here and otherwise, who are available, who've made mistakes. One of the questions we didn't get to was, what's your biggest mistake? What's a lesson that you've learned? But we'd be here till 4 days from now. But so take advantage of the community of funders of entrepreneurship. It's out there and eager to help. And in that regard, and now I'm going to shift hats myself. I'm going to, in the interest of disclosure, I'm on the board of the Philanthropy Roundtable. So what I'm saying is self-serving. I want to applaud Joe and Adam and the Roundtable for pulling this group together. I want to thank the Davidson Foundation for seeing this opportunity and seeing the need that exists for philanthropists in the entrepreneurship space to be talking with each other and to pull those things together. And this is not the first time that Joe and Adam and the Roundtable have looked at this and have done these things. And so as a cutting edge philanthropy organization, the Roundtable, I applaud the Roundtable for doing this, and Adam and Joe, and know that work will continue to make sure that we can all be as effective as possible. So thank you, panelists, and thank you, everyone.